Can you guys hear me okay? Can you guys hear me okay? All right. I really can't make out many faces, so thank you all for being here. And thank you especially to Steve and Yusuf for putting this together. Let me get things sorted. So this will be a long talk, I have to be honest, okay? But we have a lot to cover, and we got to get everybody on the same plane, roughly, all right? And I want to be completely honest from the outset. I think the way that the term race gets used today is profoundly euphemistic. You see, when I hear the terms like race and privilege and inclusion, I admittedly cringe a little. And the reason is not because I'm afraid to engage these terms. I engage them literally every day, but because I'm convinced that what we really want to talk about is racism and power. And it seems so hard to make this simple rhetorical move in U.S. society is unbelievably telling. This evasion speaks volumes, I would say, to the ways in which racism has been working in U.S. society since the 1970s and early 1980s, really. As I'll get to later, the collective evasion about racism works hand in hand with the way power works in the U.S. in the 21st century. And I think this is why activists have appropriated the term white supremacy today. This language is meant to rattle those who see racism as a problem of personal moral failings, as a problem reducible simply to personal belief and attitude, and as problems that do not affect all of us, but only some of us. This movement we call Black Lives Matter is about calling this myth into question. Indeed, I would say that it is as much a response to the failings of late 20th and early 21st century race talk as it is a product of it. You see, over the past 30 years or so, thinkers and activists committed to justice have found themselves in the tricky place of having to talk about race and privilege rather than racism. This is not simply because we find ourselves having to cater to so-called white anxiety, but also because in today's marketplace of ideas, these euphemisms have a commodity value that is disproportionate to their transformative value. But as a historian, you see, I'm principally concerned with this tricky thing we call causality. And this evasion, this shifting of our attention away from racism and toward race, it does a certain kind of work. This is because race does not explain causality. Racism does. So let me start with some definitions here. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. Racism is a social practice and thus an action. And actions take place over time and are committed by individuals and groups of individuals. Ultimately, racism seeks to make race real. It seeks to make natural inequality seem true. On the other hand, race is an ideology. Race is a collective faith that intrinsic differences distinguish humans into distinct groups of unequal rank. So let me repeat that. Race is a collective faith that intrinsic differences distinguish humans into distinct groups of unequal rank. The ideology of race sanctions inequality as natural and unavoidable. Racism can exist without the ideology of race, but over time and in the right setting, racism gives the ideology of race life. So how so? Racism works through daily practice, through daily rituals and communicative acts that make race seem like something observable and supposedly verifiable. Today, this works despite the fact that we know there is nothing scientific about it. There are no ways to distinguish between human races with DNA because race does not exist. We know this, it's a hard fact, we know it, period, okay? So another thing to consider is that racism aims to give race causal power. Thus, from the most violent white nationalist to the most sympathetic and heartfelt progressive, everyday discourse frequently serves to keep race real, and such that we see it, we feel it, and we experience it. Black folks do X, whites do Y, biracial people think Z. How many times have we heard those statements? Such shorthand reductions help us rationalize history's phantasms and cling to them for security because we can't know anything else. The ideology of race is so deeply entrenched in U.S. society that even when people on opposite ends of the political spectrum join hands in celebration and declare their commitment to so-called colorblindness, racism continues to work in our society. Saying that we do not see race does not mean the ideology of race disappears. Understanding and combating racism does. This brings me to a very, very important point. Racism as an action concerns ascribing difference, and this point is critical. The everyday practice of racism involves identifying others as part of a coherent group defined by supposed inherent traits, and ranking this other group in society according to some standard of equality. Now, racism can be practiced by anyone, but for racism to become widespread and for race to operate as an ideology, for that notion of inherent difference to actually do the work of ordering and ranking society, there must be a disproportionate distribution of power over said society's political economy, including the cultural domain that seeks to rationalize this distribution. Now, this is key. For racism to make race work, there must be an unequal distribution of power in society. So let me give you an example. If a group of space aliens landed in Baltimore and immediately proclaimed that all the Earth's humans were inferior because none of us had green skin, it might hurt some of our feelings. But unless this group could monopolize violence, control the distribution of food and other resources, and repress our ability to make cultural and legal claims to equality, their identification of our differences as inferior in and of themselves would not make humans lose power over our daily lives. This would not be a matter of injustice, but a matter of prejudice. And similarly, if these aliens arrived and pronounced green as beautiful, it might serve to promote alien pride, but it wouldn't be an act of racism. It would be a positive affirmation of identity in the face of encounter. In other words, both identity and identification are informed by power, but they are not the same thing. Racism works principally through identification, by identifying hierarchies and making them seem natural. And this is what I'm going to focus on today. Institutionalizing these hierarchies requires an unequal distribution of power that is vigilantly guarded and defended every day. Thus, racist discourse needs a critical mass of participation to organize society and to institutionalize inequality. Race ideology preserves this inequality and reproduces it by constituting markers of difference as markers of hierarchy. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. Racism aims to institutionalize inequality. Racism aims to make race real. Race ideology demands that this inequality is natural and fixed, and thus nothing can be done to change it. I need to say one more thing before getting to the history. One important function of race ideology is that it demands that races are perceived as timeless. This is a move that masks the changing patterns and historical disjunctures of racism, a move that serves to deny the agency and power behind the acts of identification. Okay? So let us get to some history. So as I see my task today, it's to shift our perspective of issues of power and the ways in which it relates to changing patterns of racism in the United States over time. We have to explore how groups have used race as a way to rank and order society and why. Now, this is a huge task and requires some dramatic abbreviations. So for our purposes today, we can really think about the changing face of racism in 3 periods, or what I'll call X. The key issue I want to get across is how the practice of racism has been remade again and again. With each moment, we see breakdown and reconstitution of power along new definitions of equality. So what is crucial to consider is how the transformation of one institution to the next involved profound changes to the workings of racism. With each shift came a new social theater within which racism would morph and change, fostering in turn new ways to normalize hierarchy and naturalize inequality to benefit some over others. The first phase I want to review we'll call empire. So I want to begin here with this rather famous image by William Blake. I want to start here because I want us to think of this not really as our starting point, but really as a turning point. This image captures something very unique about late 18th century thinking. Here we see how Blake uses the stylized image of the female body, fecund, shapely, ripe for productivity, to capture the dependence of Europe upon her colonial bodies of America and Africa. America, represented with reddish-brown skin and silky, long, dark hair stands to the right of white and bright Europe, holding her up at ribs and back. Africa, represented in dark brown tones with short, tight curls, stands to the left of Europe embracing her from behind while supporting her with grasped palms affront. We see all three figures linked together with this long, verdant rope, a representation of the ties that bound Europe to the colonial Atlantic world, a symbol of the unifying wealth borne by supporting the role of Europe's colonial bodies. I want to begin here with this image because it reveals a very modern kind of racial taxonomy. Not only does it signify the emerging and powerful role tropes of sympathy and inclusion would come to play in the history of racism, but also in its most basic sense, it serves as a window into what had become a very real and powerfully modern ideology of race. Here we see Europe, Africa, and America in ways that are likely very resonant with our own thinking today. Skin, eye, and hair color, as well as hair texture, signify separate groups of people, African or black, European or white, and perhaps the most confusing for us in the United States, American as Indian. Place and role, too, bear significantly upon the image. This thinking itself was really a child of empire. Race is the child of racism, not the parent. This very image of race, of difference embodied according to phenotype, was in fact very new when we consider the grand scale of human history. When we look at Blake's image, pay close attention to the arms of Africa and America. Here we see how Blake, in an effort to provoke subtle discussion about the relationship between equality and race, signifies the history of enslavement by way of the gold armbands wrapping around the supportive arms of both darker-skinned women. Now, the connection between racism and slavery is long-standing, yet I must explain that Blake's image was the product of a very distinct kind of slavery, plantation slavery. Now, slavery as a social practice is ancient. The institution of plantation slavery, however, is relatively new. It was the plantation, above all else, that gave credence to the notion that society could be organized according to the triptych, distinct hierarchies represented in Blake's image. Prior to the rise of the Atlantic plantation complex, legal sanctions for slavery were based on religious law. Skin color, the key ascriptive category of modern racial thinking, was not cited as a justification for slavery in the Mediterranean. Indeed, we know that the term slave itself is derived from the ancient Greek word Slav, an ethnonym used to identify those of present-day Eastern Europe who were viewed as particularly ripe for enslavement in the Greek world. Now, in the Middle Ages, Catholic decree and Islamic law maintained that enslavement can only be reserved for social outsiders who refused conversion after being captured in war. Fellow Catholics and Muslims could not be enslaved. Religion, not skin color, determined enslavability. Now, this is not to say that we don't find prejudicial references to dark skin in the writings of scribes and ecclesiastics, whether they be Catholic, Muslim, or Hebrew. But in the context of Christendom and the Islamic caliphates that dominated the Mediterranean, these discourses did not by any means structure the hierarchy of society. Modern racial ideologies simply did not exist. Hence, throughout the Mediterranean world in the Middle Ages, we find that people who we would describe as white, black, or Arab today were sold side by side and often forced to labor together. Now, this historical fact is important for understanding why the figures in Blake's image could represent distinct races of people by the end of the 18th century, when the power of religious ideology was rapidly eroding in the face of Enlightenment, rationality, and liberalism. So let us look at the map of the Atlantic world and quickly trace the peculiar history of the plantation. Now, as long as the plantation remained really in this zone, in the early 1400s, slavery was not defined by race, nor was it hereditary, which is very important. However, as the plantation complex moved westward, it began to change. Note that this is the very same time that Islamic influence in the Iberian Peninsula began to wane. Genoese and Venetian merchants familiar with the plantation model began to transplant it along the islands of West Africa, first to Madeira, then the Canaries, and then Cape Verde. Here. In all of these places, the labor force remained multicolored until finally, at around 1520, it reached this tiny island of Sao Tome. It's here for the first time in history that groups of men from Europe commanded a colony and an enslaved labor force entirely composed of Africans alone. From Sao Tome, Portuguese traders transplanted the racialized plantation to Brazil, And from there, Dutch merchants planted it in the Guianas, and they brought it to Barbados, the English traded it up the Caribbean, and finally to Virginia in the 1660s. Now, almost a century and a half before the plantation reached Virginia, Spanish settlers began to draw on the model and adapt it to Spanish colonialism. Indeed, it was the introduction of this model to the Spanish Caribbean that caused a new ideology of race to emerge, the one that was signified in Blake's reddish American figure. Widespread violence and a rising death toll of Indians on Spanish plantations, called encomiendas, sparked a major religious debate about whether Native Americans could be enslaved or not. Racial discourses were central to these debates. Some, such as Bartholomew Las Casas, argued that Native Americans were in fact humans who possessed the capacity for reason and an immortal soul. Others, such as Governor Oviedo of Santo Domingo, argued that indigenous peoples of America were devoid of reason and morality. Indeed, Oviedo proclaimed that the indigenous inhabitants of Santo Domingo did not even have men's heads, but simply thick skulls that made their, quote, understanding bestial and evilly inclined. Thus, we find some of the core dynamics of modern racial thought emerging, with its fixation on inherent corporeal traits as a cause for inequality. These debates, however, were not about equality in the modern sense that we think of it today. They focus instead on whether or not Native Americans were capable of being part of Spanish colonial society. And this is a really, really important point to understand. These debates rested squarely on theological disputes about who was and who was not capable of entering into the community of Catholics, and conversely, who could and could not be enslaved. In the middle of the 16th century, Iberian monarchs imagined themselves not simply as defenders of the faith, but as agents of a God who wanted souls to be saved by way of baptism into the church. This belief lent itself to a flexible definition of who could and could not be included into the society of God itself, profoundly hierarchical and determined by birth as it was. And ultimately, this is why Spain's King Charles V sided with Las Casas. In 1542, Spain's new laws formally outlawed the enslavement of Native Americans at the hands of Spanish colonists. In doing so, the law stipulated that Native Americans were not less than human, but humans of a lesser kind, a race of people spanning islands and continents. Now, this did not mitigate violence by any means, but it did establish a critical precedent upon which Spanish authorities would define civic inclusion in the empire. Slavery, in turn, would be reserved for Africans and Africans alone. You guys following? Okay. It's a lot. We've got a lot more to go, too. Ultimately, these debates had extremely long-lasting consequences, as they framed disputes that would shape new ideas about the relationship between race and civil status in the Iberian empires. These religious justifications of difference intersected with matters of labor and race in various ways across space and time in Latin America. Ultimately, this interplay would give rise to the Baroque notions of status and racial difference reflected in the famous Costa paintings, which provided authorities in Mexico, for example, a visual guide for how to classify the various taxable classes of Spain's imperial subjects according to invented notions of racial taxonomy. Of course, I raised the emergent racial taxonomies of 18th century Spanish colonies for a few reasons. First, it is a tendency for people in the United States to map their own racial ideologies across the globe, and as noted earlier, to embrace the notion that their idea of race is a real and timeless truth. Second, it is critical to understand how race and civic status operate through much of Latin America during the colonial period, strangely enough, because we find very similar patterns at work in early Virginia prior to the consolidation of the plantation complex in the 1670s. Between the 1620s and 1670s, Virginia looked much like the Baroque world of many Latin American colonies. Though brought to the colony in small numbers as slaves, many Africans were able to purchase their freedom or gain manumission. Countless others were even able to amass large quantities of land, purchase indentured servant contracts, vote, take white men to court and win, and of course, fight alongside English planters and indentured servants when simmering tensions with Indian communities rose to a boil. Interracial unions were not even banned or forbidden. The social denial of enslaved Africans that came to dominate what would eventually become the United States was, in other words, uncertain and not preordained. And this is very important. But the Baroque world of early Virginia would come crashing down on free Africans and their families by the end of the 17th century. Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 proved a major crisis for Virginia's elites, as a motley group of free and enslaved Africans, poor European settlers, and upstart farmers burnt Jamestown to the ground, driving the governor out of the fledgling colony's ramshackle capital. While Virginia's elites had already begun to roll back on the civil protections of the colony's black landed families, Bacon's Rebellion signaled to them that a largely landless class of colonists was a threat to the hierarchical order of the colonial regime. And within 15 years, Virginia's General Assembly would pass laws forbidding interracial marriage, sex, and leisure, deny voting rights to landed black men, and outlaw violence committed by blacks against Christians. Indeed, much of these laws codified a strict line between the previously blurry distinctions of Indian, Negro, and Christian as used in the parlance of 17th century Virginia. Much like this pamphlet on screen, colonial Virginia, and with it most of the United States, would take on a very binary view about the relationship between race and freedom. I could go on about what Peter Wood famously called the terrible transformation of colonial North America. And this, indeed, is a subject worthy of a long lecture in and of itself. But what is crucial to understand is that, unlike in the Catholic empires of Spain and Portugal, the Protestant empires, by and large, denied civil protections to enslaved Indians and Africans. In North America in particular, where the size of the enslaved community was a minority, this served to empower poor white labor over enslaved labor and thereby undermine the kind of alliances that had given rise to Bacon's Rebellion. But it also produced a very different kind of racial ideology, one that would be unquestionably tested by the rise of Enlightenment rationality and its secular claims to birthright equality and freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Every child in the United States learns this line from the Declaration of Independence at some point. I hope, I think, I don't know, maybe. But it's often the case when Americans think about the relationship between hereditary racial slavery and the creation of the United States, people turn to a simple explanation of, it's just the way it was, right? But such a simplistic formulation completely denies how the radical potential of the Enlightenment, as ushered forth in the American and French revolutions, actually demanded a completely new kind of racial ideology. Though largely nationalist in aims, the American Revolution was informed by the growing Atlantic turn against hereditary status and toward birthright equality. Just like the notion of aristocratic privilege, slavery too was grounded fundamentally in the notion that one's status was fixed at birth. In short, what we see is thinkers like Jefferson struggling to reconcile these tensions. What emerges in turn is a new ideology about race that appropriates scientific language and hence its secular rationality to reconcile the problem of black freedom that black freedom supposedly posed to this completely new idea of citizenship and the social contract. Thus, we find Jefferson in his famous Notes on the State of Virginia focused squarely on justifying the inherent inequality of the black race. Gone are concerns about redeemable souls or benevolent monarchs. Instead, we see an American slave owner inspired by the rising tide of Atlantic liberalism, denying universal equality at the same time that he proclaims it. The mixture of black and white freedom was deemed a threat to republicanism itself because of the inherent endowments of body and mind. So make no mistake about it, the construction of racial ideology has been at the heart of the Enlightenment ideas, about equality since the notion itself became central to the identity of nationhood. And this theme is so brilliantly captured in this portrait of the former African slave turned free French citizen, Jean-Baptiste Bellay. Now, I'd love to talk more about this image later, but for now, I have to move on. Focusing on modern racism requires us to consider, with deep analytical work, the very ways in which we understand the seemingly obvious term equality, for the term itself bears a profound historical weight. Much like the world of 16th century Spain, the terms of inclusion used to define social society dictated the meaning of equality itself in the 19th century United States. Now, I've decided to call Act 2 Civilization because when we look at the changing nature of racism and its relationship to inequality, both social reformers and reactionaries turn to the rhetoric of civilization to remake racial hierarchy as the slave system in the United States was eradicated. Now, there are many ways to think about the 19th century United States. Most Americans think of the Civil War, or what many historians now call the Second American Revolution. Now, the abolition of slavery was, without a doubt, a revolutionary moment in American history. It completely undid an entire way of life predicated fundamentally on the racialized plantation regime. What this meant in turn was the nation itself had to be remade. So just a few really important facts. Between 1619 and 1808, roughly 400,000 Africans were sold to the region that became the United States. This was only 4% of the entire Atlantic slave trade. But by 1860, the United States had, by far, the largest enslaved population in the history of the world. Nearly 4 million people were enslaved, roughly 85% of all people of African descent living in the United States. In sheer economic terms, by 1836, nearly 50% of U.S. economic activity was attributable to cotton, which was produced by enslaved people. By 1850, enslaved blacks accounted for 1/5 of all wealth in the United States. By 1860, more millionaires lived per capita in the Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. So what do all these stats reveal? If it was an independent nation, the South would have been the 4th richest nation in the world in 1860. So make no mistake about it. The Civil War was a revolution. It was a bloody, bloody revolution. It marked a complete upending of a centuries-long way of life whose origins stretched all the way back to Sao Tome. So think about this fact for a minute. How many of you have seen the film Lincoln? How many of you saw this film? Okay, so what is the core of that film about? Anybody? Hopefully. Okay. Huh? It's about the passage of the 13th Amendment, which eradicated slavery, okay? So, quiz. I'm thinking we don't know the answer to this, but what was the final vote count in the House on January 31st, 1865, that ultimately enabled the amendment to move forward for ratification? In other words, the vote count that enabled slavery to be eradicated in the United States by constitutional amendment. What was the vote count?
Passed by 2 votes.
There you go. 3 votes, 2 or 3, depending on how you do the math, right? So you need 2/3 votes to pass the amendment. So let that sink in for a minute. 2 people, maybe 3, counting that little sliver of a percentage, passed the abolition of slavery into the Constitution. What I want us to think about here in Act 2 is perhaps best represented in these before and after pictures of Hubbard Pryor. These pictures tell 2 interwoven stories, in my view, and I think they'll help us wrap our heads around why I'm calling the second act Civilization. So for those of you unfamiliar with Hubbard Pryor, he was born enslaved in Georgia. At the age of 22, hearing news of the Emancipation Proclamation, he decided to run away to Tennessee in hopes of joining the Union lines in a fight against slavery. On April 7th, 1864, Pryor finally reached Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he joined the Union Army's 44th Colored Division. As you can see from this image, when Pryor arrived, he was wearing so-called Negro clothes, or slave clothes, the rags that he had on his back when he fled the Georgia plantation. But when he reached Union lines, he received not simply new clothes, but the clothes of a soldier and of a man. And here on the right, we see Pryor in full stance with a gun at his side. So I want us to imagine for a minute what this must have meant to him. He had made himself free. Not only that, but Pryor was ready. And quite frankly, I think he was ready to kick some rebel ass, right? So now imagine what this image might have meant to his former owner, whose entire sense of self was measured against that Hubbard on the left. person whose very manhood he denied existed. Hence, we see here one side of what this image captures, what the Civil War meant to Hubbard Pryor and millions like him who wanted to abolish slavery once and for all. But we have to dig a little deeper here, okay? We have to ask ourselves why, ultimately, the photographer created this dyadic portrait. Not only does this image capture Pryor's spirit, but it also tells us about the ways supporters of the Union were making their case for the inclusion of African Americans into the new nation. The purpose of this image was to show officials in Washington and Unionists in the North that black people could, if granted the opportunity, move from the barbarism of slavery to upstanding civilization, marked here in the image of manhood. Both pro-slavery Southerners and racist Northerners had long insisted, like Jefferson before them, that black people were inherently incapable of being civilized, thus incapable of participating in democracy. But what I want to underscore is that the most influential and powerful antithesis of that argument among the influential classes was itself profoundly influenced by a new kind of racism understood in terms of civilization. Who, after all, were the arbiters of what did and did not mark civilization? By and large, this was not simply white people, but middle class, pious, and importantly, Protestant men and women. Civilization in the eyes of the vast majority of Northern reformers was hence wrapped up in notions of sobriety, property ownership, individual responsibility, proper comportment, strict boundaries between male and female gender roles, sexuality, and proper religious practice, just to name a few. So what we know, scholars of slavery know, is that nearly all of these norms actually ran counter to the very communal practices that had enabled enslaved women, men, and children to survive the incredible violence of the slave regime. So in other words, civilization was not a neutral term, nor a race-free way of reorganizing society along the terms of social inclusion. Now, I'm not saying here that the pious men and women who dedicated themselves to the aims of the Second American Revolution were really bad people. They risked life and limb to free nearly 4 million people from bondage and revolutionize a nation around the central notion of freedom. Creating freedom schools, teaching free people how to read and write, advocating for the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment, these were part of the revolutionary moment, no doubt. The passage of the Reconstruction Acts was absolutely transformative. In fact, the victories of universal suffrage for black men not only upended the Herrenvolk republicanism of the South, but also forced those states in the North that had outlawed black voting rights to accept new boundaries of citizenship as well. But the discourse of civilization profoundly shaped how reactionaries and reformers rationalized the end of slavery in the United States. Misinformation about Reconstruction is rampant, for it has been completely misrepresented by the so-called Southern Redeemer propaganda since the early 20th century. Without a doubt, black voters in the South had helped usher in a major reforms in free Southern society between 1865 and 1870s. Reconstruction was a battle for democracy. Black voters throughout the South enacted laws that established public schools, established social services for poor whites and blacks alike, and helped create public medical care. Of course, much of this hinged on federal support and the protection of federal troops in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau, which played a critical role in mediating disputes between free people and their former owners, overseers, and poor whites who refused to accept black suffrage. However, support of the federal intervention in the South fundamentally required support from Northern Republicans in Congress. Starting in 1873, the U.S. entered a period that contemporaries came to call the Great Depression, which would last into the late 1890s. In turn, Northern Republican support for Reconstruction began to wane. Now, this image is called the ignorant vote. What it captures is how Northern elites began to accept white Southern propaganda about Reconstruction, which argued that black voters were uneducated, uncivilized, and incapable of running Southern politics. Thus, on the left, we see the Southern stereotype of the minstrel-like, shoeless black voter of the Reconstructed South. Note that he sits on a scale. On the opposite end is the northern stereotype of another racialized and stereotyped figure, that of the poor, supposedly ignorant, and seemingly bestial Irish-American free laborer. This was how many wealthy people in the North viewed Irish Americans. What this image was capturing was the choice that moderate Northern Republicans faced as they saw it. Either they support the so-called uncivilized rule of black Reconstruction, or they court the uncivilized votes of the Northern Irishman away from the Democrats. Ultimately, the tensions around this choice caused a splintering of the Republican coalition as a new party formed that tried to reject both sides of the scale and appeal to elite white Protestants alone. The result was the disputed presidential election of 1876. In the South, escalating terrorism carried out in full daylight against black voters resulted in disputed electoral votes in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. In a backroom deal, Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes convinced key members of the committee charged with deciding the election that he would guarantee the South, quote, the blessings of honest and capable local self-government. The committee granted the presidency to Hayes, who immediately ordered the remaining federal troops guarding the state houses in Louisiana and South Carolina to withdraw. This would mark the beginning of what white Southerners would call the Redeemer Movement or the Lost Cause. Harper's Weekly artist Thomas Nast had foreshadowed this renewed alliance nearly a decade earlier, of course, in his 1868 sketch properly titled The White Man's Government. Here we see the Irish voter on the left embracing the hands of a former Confederate and a Northern businessman. The Irish voter holds a club, the Confederate a knife that reads The Lost Cause, and importantly, the Northerner, his billfold, which reads Capital. Together they stand with their feet atop the back of a black Union veteran and citizen, his Union kepi hat kicked from his head. Indeed, the Northern backlash against free black labor and black political power helped usher a return of Democratic power in key theaters throughout the South. Later, it would help the Republican Party capture the urban vote in the North. So those of you who are paying attention will notice something provocative about this image. Recall that the central thrust of my talk today is concerned with the changing nature of racism and its relationship to the broader political economy of the nation and notions of equality. The Irish-American free laborer is clearly different, near simian in appearance from the Confederate and Northern capitalist. At the same time, however, he is clearly not black, as represented by the prone Union soldier under his foot. How then do we understand this evasive term, the white race, and its relationship to terms of equality? For clearly, in this picture, our Irishman is represented at some other stage of human evolution in comparison to his allies in their struggle against multiracial democracy. What the image captures is the profound historical instability of the term white people itself. As we can see, being white has clearly been marked by more than just skin color in the past. What this was about was casting him as not quite civilized. In the 19th century, many academics and scientists had adopted the insights of Darwin to argue that distinct human races had emerged over time and that their mental capacity could be identified according to things like bone structure and skull size. All of this was taken as evidence that there was an immutable hierarchy of civilization, atop of which stood not simply white people, and not even always Europeans, but quite often the Anglo-Saxon. Social reformers understood their own agenda in terms of civilization as well. Many reformers became obsessed with trying to understand why crime and disease seemed to be so prevalent in the urban centers of the North, where Sicilians and other immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had been crowded into slum housing in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Some argued with a vengeance that these so-called new immigrants were inherently inferior and ultimately a lesser kind of white. The Yale professor Charles Sumner's theory of social Darwinism seemed to prove for many that inequality was as natural as the trees and bees. And a whole field of study emerged that aimed to help social reformers figure out whether or not things like nose size and shape correlated with crime. Now, unlike the reactionaries who hoped to keep the new immigrants in their place, social reformers insisted that poverty and crime resulted from the fact that these communities supposedly lacked access to a civilized American culture. To promote their ideas of reform, social workers drew on models learned from the so-called Indian schools, which reformers created as Native Americans were increasingly concentrated into the reservation system. In the cities, progressive reformers created settlement houses that sought to Americanize the new immigrants and teach them how to be civilized in the United States. Not only would new immigrants be taught English, but they would also be taught rules of comportment, hygiene, proper sexual mores, and industrial education, all critical elements for becoming a proper and productive citizen in the eyes of progressive reformers. Mostly organized by middle-class women, the settlement houses were also viewed as a counterbalance to the racialized scientific language of the era. In short, the beneficence of reform established an avenue for the new immigrants of the North to prove that they could overcome their supposed deficiencies and adopt the baseline standard of American culture. What transpired, in turn, was the eventual invention of a completely new category, the Caucasian. This was an umbrella term created as social scientists began to lump multi-ethnic white America together under a new common category, mostly used for evaluating crime. It only had one antithesis, the Negro. Although reformers helped immigrants with social services, it is absolutely critical to understand that many of these same progressive ideas about civilization proved a powerful force for violence in the late 19th century. Indeed, many of these same reformers supported the growing imperial aims of the United States government during the Spanish-American War. This image, for example, depicts a group of eager and ready middle-class reformers literally bringing the guidebooks of civilization to Filipinos as the US troops leave stage left. While some reformers backed US interventions abroad by justifying it through the lens of civilization, and while reformers in northern cities worked to eradicate the racism leveled against the new immigrants, Southern reactionaries likewise used the language of civilization to stigmatize free blacks throughout the South. In small pockets throughout Southern states, interracial coalitions of black and white politicians had continued to make gains even after the Compromise of 1877. At the same time, however, the tenuous nature of sharecropping had enabled land and commercial power to reconstitute into fewer, mostly white elite hands. All was not lost, however. For a brief moment, a new political party emerged in the South, one that threatened their stranglehold. Poor white and black farmers tried to fight back by creating what they called the People's Party, otherwise known as the Populists. And they aimed to give the poor agricultural laborers throughout the South more control over the marketing of cotton and other crops. As C. Van Woodward famously illustrated in his classic work, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, elite Southern Democrats responded to the People's Party with a transparent policy of divide and rule. Almost in orchestrated succession, states throughout the South implemented new political instruments to exclude black voters and political influence, such as poll taxes and literacy tests. At the same time, the state legislatures passed new laws that segregated public accommodations, broke apart formerly integrated schools, and bolstered their so-called vagrancy laws. The political consequences of Jim Crow law in the South were unbelievable. Take, for example, Louisiana. During Reconstruction alone, black mobilization had registered nearly 130,000 black voters in the state. But as Southern states enacted Jim Crow and the Supreme Court defended the right to do so, black political influence dropped precipitously. By 1898, only 1,300 African Americans were registered to vote in the entire state of Louisiana. I just read a fact today, by 1900 there was no black public high schools at all in the South. Jim Crow was ultimately a policy of creating what historians have called white popular sovereignty in the South. It created a rule book of sumptuary laws and codes that gave poor whites power over black mobility and deference. With their political power rapidly withdrawn, black Southerners increasingly found themselves subject to the terrorism of lynching. Southern blacks received little sympathy at the national level, too. Middle-class black reformers like Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois struggled to bring attention to the terrorism of lynching, but without much political influence, their efforts to point out the uncivilized nature of Southern terror fell on deaf ears. Estimates suggest that nearly 4,000 African Americans, mostly black men falsely accused of rape, were lynched between 1870 and 1950. Hung from trees, lit on fire, shot with shotguns, Lynchers often explained the violence in the idiom of the day. Black people were uncivilized, and they needed to be kept in their place, beyond the realm of mixture. Racism seeks to make race real, to preserve inequality. Hopefully by now we all have at least a tertiary understanding of this complex relationship between notions of equality and racism. Racism has continually informed both reactionary notions as well as progress by continually appealing again and again to new notions of difference, whether they were defined by biblical precedent, scientific claims, and now increasingly in the 20th century, culture. We've seen the earliest incarnations of this in Act I, Empire, from the appeals of early humanism of Las Casas to the enlightened universalism of Jefferson. We've seen it in Act II, where the rhetoric of civilization set the terms of inclusion after the Civil War. And we've seen how reformers used it to fight against scientific racism while simultaneously fighting for the notion of superior culture. So here we are at our third act. Now, I've wrestled greatly with how to describe the new face of racism in the 20th and 21st century. And I've decided to call Act 3 Choice. I believe this term captures the confusing way in which racism has shaped contemporary notions of equality. To get at what I mean by this, I want to start with this map. Many of you have seen maps like this. They're oftentimes called redlining maps, but in the era of the New Deal, they were known as residential security maps. Residential security maps were created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was established by an act of Congress in 1933. The HLLC was a government-sponsored corporation. The purpose of the HLOC was to establish a way to prevent home foreclosures by providing refinancing for homeowners. In 1935, the federal government asked the HOLC to establish maps that would be used by the newly formed Federal Housing Administration. The maps ranked neighborhoods according to A, B, C, and D loan risk ratings. D neighborhoods were often designated in red, and thus the maps are often known as redlining maps. Now, by the 1930s, the vast majority of these D areas had become the new epicenters of the Black community. Industrialization during World War I had spurred the great migration of African Americans into cities throughout the country, where they arrived largely penniless but eager to seek out work, factory work, or, for women in particular, domestic labor. But it wasn't simply the concentration of poverty that was the issue here. It was the inability to escape it. Historians and sociologists have studied how these maps got created and implemented, and what they've ultimately discovered is that while there is no explicit federal policy of racial exclusion, the map makers essentially used census numbers to establish the neighborhood boundaries. When they did so, almost every neighborhood that had even a small number of Black residents was deemed more risky. Thus, the A neighborhoods, those deemed least risky and ripe for the best loans, were virtually entirely white. What this system ultimately did was incentivize home builders, white homeowners, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders to enhance and exacerbate segregation in the housing market. Integrated and minority communities were ipso facto deemed a financial risk and made ineligible for low-cost home loans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion worth of home loans. More than 98% went to white homebuyers, many of whom were the sons and daughters of the previous era's new immigrants. At the same time, those African Americans who could afford to purchase a home were forced to do so in so-called riskier neighborhoods. The result was that many Black homeowners watched as their housing values dropped as much as 80% during the same period. In short, suburbanization throughout the United States came to take on a Jim Crow-like quality. Take, for example, Detroit, where the auto industry boom had attracted thousands of immigrants and African Americans prior to World War II. In Detroit, real estate agents and home builders worked together to create what they called neighborhood associations. The point of these neighborhood associations was to scare hopeful African American families away from the areas that were coming under development, such as those B-risk areas. Neighborhood associations organized protests and pickets when Black doctors and lawyers tried to move into the bucolic, tree-lined streets on the outskirts of the city. And many times they even provoked outright violence and terror against Black middle-class residents. And I actually read a fascinating statistic, and this might shed some light on this. I read a statistic that said there was more people who identified as members of the Ku Klux Klan living in Michigan between 1930s and 1950s than there was in Alabama at the same time. This was because of housing. One of the most infamous examples of trying to secure housing practices is this wall, built along Detroit's famous 8 Mile Road. 6 feet high, the wall was constructed not simply to divide the black and white neighborhoods, but it also served as a visual reminder to prospective homebuyers that the white neighborhood was protected, safe, and ultimately apart from black Detroit. The seemingly race-blind language of the New Deal, in short, helped to expand the choices and wealth available to some at the expense of others. Millions of African Americans had been driven from the South, hopeful that their exodus would yield them a new kind of freedom. But once in the North, they faced a new set of discriminatory practices that limited their ability to escape poverty yet again. Even those elite few who had secured an advanced education watched as they were literally walled off from the opportunities generated by New Deal liberalism and its Cold War antecedents. Homeownership in America became the core route to becoming middle class, became the means to transgenerational wealth accumulation and the means for sending children to college. And ultimately, it helped make the US economy a consumer economy. By the 1950s, the image of the suburban home had become a symbol of America's claims to democratic choice. Indeed, the suburban kitchen, replete with shiny toasters, washing machines, and mass-market detergents, became a symbol in the American Cold War fight against communism. The ability to choose where to live, what to buy, these had become the symbols of American freedom. And this was reserved by and large for the mythic white America. Important to note, however, is that all of this was made possible with the particular support of the Southern Democrats, who sustained disproportionate representation in Congress while simultaneously reaping tax dollars from the millions of disenfranchised black residents of the Jim Crow South. Thus, we find the particular brilliance of the first wave of the modern civil rights movement. In the era of the Cold War, which was pitched as a battle between American democratic freedom and communist slavery, the fact that the United States was essentially an apartheid state really didn't play well abroad. This was, of course, despite efforts by the government to tell a different story. Hence, we find the Eisenhower administration prodding black jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie to play concerts abroad to silence international concern about Jim Crow at home. After the court victories against school desegregation in the mid-1950s, the young people who began to challenge the edifice of Jim Crow struck at these key mythic consumer symbols of American choice. One of the earliest and most powerful attacks against Jim Crow came in the form of the famous lunch counter sit-ins, when college-age students used respectability as a weapon to highlight the contradictions inherent in the consumerist model of American freedom. Excluded as voters, threatened with violence, but in the age of the living room television, what better way to fight for freedom than to highlight the fact that if black, one could not buy a damn root beer float at the local Woolworths. As student leaders like Diane Nash knew well, these challenges to the Jim Crow order in the South were simply the tip of the spear. If the Civil War was the United States' second American Revolution, then the Civil Rights Movement was its second Reconstruction. Indeed, Civil Rights Acts of 1960, 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Executive Order 11246 of 1965, which guaranteed affirmative action in government contracts, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were all aimed at reinstating black citizenship and eliminating the racist exclusions enacted under the New Deal. So all of this brings us full circle to where I began. By the 1970s, a myth about white flight had emerged among furious tax-paying citizens about these expansions of the New Deal order. As the myth suggests, urban whites fled the cities because of black unrest and failed governance. And as myths do, this completely erased the facts of history. Long forgotten was the fact that the federal government had helped empower the creation of the suburbs through direct investment and with it, enormous growth in middle-class consumer wealth. Of course, this myth emerged alongside the rapid decline of the industrial sector in the cities, where black and brown Americans remained incredibly confined despite some electoral victories. What emerged then was quite remarkable. Since the late 19th century, the idea of social welfare had been a cornerstone of progressive responses to inequality. The New Deal, spurred in large part by labor activism, had revolutionized that notion. Industrial production during World War II helped millions of newly white Americans develop a savings, but it was the growth of the suburbs that enabled them to turn those savings into inheritable wealth. But as soon as African Americans were able to expand their access to many of these very same opportunities, suburbanites decided to support candidates who argued that government programs were handouts to a people who chose to be poor. Welfare, food stamp, public housing, all of these programs helped invent the myth of white America. As Ira Katz-Nelson brilliantly noted, affirmative action was originally white. But by the 1970s, these very terms became dog whistle terms for the so-called black undeserving poor. Most famous of these terms was the notion of the welfare queen, a valence-gendered reference used by Ronald Reagan in 1976 in his first bid for the presidency. Legal scholar Ian Lopez defines dog whistle politics as a, quote, new racial, supposedly colorblind discourse that keeps up the steady drumbeat of subliminal racial grievances and appeals to color-coded solidarity. Terms straight out of the 1970s, states' rights, welfare, busing, colorblindness, and now illegals, gangsters, thugs, etc., enable political operatives to trump up support while simultaneously being able to claim that they vehemently oppose racism and repudiate hate speech in all of its forms. But the kernel of this transformation had actually been planted by Lyndon Johnson himself in 1968. In response to the urban unrest that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Johnson shelved targeted recommendations for addressing poverty in the inner cities in exchange for a tough-on-crime approach. His successor, Richard Nixon, seized upon this gift, ran on that tough-on-crime platform, and gave birth to the phrase war on drugs. Ultimately, the dog whistle proved incredibly beneficial for mobilizing voters against New Deal liberalism and against nearly any form of redistributive taxation. Its supposedly colorblind rhetoric gave moral force to claims that the free market, not any kind of affirmative action, was the best way to create opportunities and right historic wrongs. So both Republican and Democratic parties adopted this tough-on-crime rhetoric in various ways in the 1980s, as they vied for votes of a largely amnesiac, middle-class electorate, now largely convinced that the urban welfare queens were ubiquitous and thugs weren't dads and brothers, but rather social deviants produced by a so-called culture of pathology. Social programs like welfare, now supposedly black in hue, became something that needed to be ran against or reformed. Crime bills and stiff drug sentencing rules became part of both parties' most cherished repertoires at election time. It's worth noting, of course, that there were and remain far more white Americans on welfare and food stamps. But somehow many Americans refuse to believe this. Remember, the point of racism is to make race seem real, right? So, how does this all play out today? For a case study, let's focus for a moment on St. Louis, and particularly the municipality of Ferguson. Much like Detroit, Baltimore, and other cities, Ferguson is a community defined by enormous inequality. The unemployment level is pushing 15% of the population there. 1 in 4 people who live in Ferguson live below the poverty line. Now, the median income, is $37,000 a year. The vast majority of its residents are renters, in fact, who move there in an effort to flee poorer parts of the city. Hemmed in by poverty on all sides, for many moving there was a choice of the lesser of two evils. Yet political power in Ferguson was incredibly lopsided. Two out of 3 residents of Ferguson are black. But the school board and city council was entirely white till just recently. At the time of Michael Brown's death, 52 of 55 police officers in the city were also white. So what did this stack up to? In the era of austerity, the municipality found itself constantly in the red, bailed out only through municipal bonds. What was revealed in the Department of Justice report illustrates the shocking realities of the so-called post-civil rights era of American history. The second largest source of revenue for the municipality, roughly 15%. The biggest source was sales tax. The second largest, 15%, came from policing, fines, and penalties. Some news reports suggest that the rate of fines and penalties providing to the public coffers was near 30% in other nearby municipalities. So people were given tickets for things like manner of walking in roadway and high grass and weeds. And the trick is if you can't pay the fine, which many of the residents can't do because they're poor and jobless, they get fined again and again, creating a cycle of indebtedness to the government. And sometimes you even have to go to jail. So another startling statistic, the municipality of Ferguson has 21,000 residents. But the DOJ discovered that outstanding arrest warrants in the municipality reached 16,000 by December of 2014. In other words, policing of the black poor became a key means for funding the municipality. So, how can one sum up the history of racism in one 90-minute talk, or however long it's been? You can't, okay? You can't. You can only point out the elements, connections, and changing nature of racism and hope that you leave your audience feeling anger or eagerness, or better yet, maybe, curiosity. So far today I've spoken about the intersections of racism, power, and notions of equality. I've talked about causality and the genesis of modern racist thought as a basis for securing slavery. I've talked about how the Civil War was a revolution and Reconstruction a fight for democracy. I've talked about civilization and how it was defined and redefined in terms of race and color. I've talked about Jim Crow and inequality in the age of colorblindness. And I've talked about choice and how redlining practices, although seemingly dealt with in 1968, continue to lead to a lack of choice for many poor African Americans. So in ending, I challenge you to get angry a little, maybe, be eager, develop a healthy curiosity about this history. So if you feel that I'm wrong, please try to prove me wrong. With facts, please, okay? But more than that, keep learning, because as I tell my students, knowledge is about much more than what you think you know. So thank you very much.